Hi, Mark.
Hi, Bob.
How are you doing?
I'm doing great.
I
Everybody does great in Maui. It's kind of hard not to
Yeah, I
do
can
great.
tell you're doing great there. You are, in stark contrast to me, you are in Hawaii. Um,
Just for the month, I'm on leave this term, and this is a good place to work. I know it seems odd to work on religion and violence in such a beautiful location, but here I am.
well, we struggle through the best we can, and I admire your keeping a stiff upper lip about all this. You want to show people the ocean view
Yeah,
there?
how about a gratuitous view of the ocean?
Yeah,
Yeah, you see what I have to put up with,
it's a
but
tough life, the being a leading scholar on religious violence. So let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is the Wright Show. You are Mark Juergensmeyer. A scholar of comparative religion, and for a long time now, in the forefront of the study of religious violence. Your book, Terror in the Mind of God, which was about that subject, actually came out before 9/11, a year before 9/11. So you were kind of ahead of the curve there, I guess. And even before that, in I think 1993, you published a book. This is back when people were still celebrating how wonderful life was going to be now that the Cold War was over. And you published a book on how, broadly speaking, I think you could say how religion might become a big source of tension and conflict now that the Cold War was no longer going to serve that
yeah, the book
purpose.
was called The New Cold War with a question mark, and the question was whether religious nationalism or transnationalism in the case of Al Qaeda or ISIS is going to be the new confrontation and the new kind of global enemy.
Hmm.
And this was in wrote this book in '92. It was written in '90, published first in '93. It's been updated recently under new title, Global Rebellion, but it turned out to be sadly kind of prescient.
Hmm. And you taught for a long time at Berkeley, and then also at UC Santa Barbara.
Yeah.
And is Santa Barbara your current affiliation, or?
Yes, right. I'm
Okay,
still teaching there, and as I say, I'm on leave this term. That's why I'm in Maui, but I'll be back teaching in the spring.
okay. And one other interesting fact about you is, I am here at Union Theological Seminary in New York, where I am visiting professor of science and religion. You got your master's here, and you were one of the very last graduate students of Reinhold Niebuhr, who, for our younger viewers, I will explain, was a really leading, one of the most famous intellectuals in America in mid 20th century, and not just a theologian, but a thinker about foreign policy and a very influential one. He was on the cover of Time magazine, I think maybe twice.
Mhm.
And I actually want to talk to you before we're done here about,
He's
what.
the most. Barack Obama regards him as his most influential influence, and so does Jimmy Carter.
Mhm.
He's the guy that got me thinking about religion and violence and religion and politics. So really, everything that I've been doing throughout my career is because of Riney and my connection with Niebuhr and Niebuhr's thought.
Riney was his nickname?
Yeah.
I have not heard that.
Yeah,
Um,
I know it seems funny, but he was a real person, not just a great thinker. And I was almost literally one of his last students. My first year at Union was the last time he taught a full seminar,
mhm.
and then the second year, four of us, including John Raines, Ron Stone, and myself, met in his apartment. And then the third year, they had going on because they were graduate students, and so I just met with him by myself. So I was literally his last student.
You were his last student. That's
Hmm.
amazing. And he's actually has remained relevant in the sense that his name has been invoked as we have struggled with the question of how to respond to the latest wave of religiously connected violence. So in after 9/11, when Peter Beinart, who was editor of the New Republic, wrote a big piece favoring a hawkish response. Peter has since had a change of heart, bless his heart, and he's now revised his views in the wake of the Iraq fiasco. But at that point, the New Republic was championing the invasion of Iraq, and they invoked Reinhold Niebuhr on their side of that argument. And of course, Niebuhr was in some ways taken as a cold warrior, and I don't know what you think of all that. Certainly, by the end of this conversation, I'd like to ask you what you think Reinhold Niebuhr would say we should do now about the
Sure.
predicament we're in. But
Hmm.
he has maintained a kind of presence in the debate.
Yeah. Yeah, and rightfully so. He started off in life as a socialist and a pacifist, as well as a Christian pastor. And a lot of his socialism came from being a pastor in Detroit, in a church where the workers were very much affected by the capitalist structure of the time, which turns out to be increasingly like the capitalist structure of our time. After a wave of the labor movement, which Niebuhr greatly supported because he thought that countervailing power was necessary. But he began to turn both from his socialism and his pacifism, in part because of the rise of Stalin, and seeing the way in which a good idea, when with lofty goals, could be perverted in the hands of someone with a very kind of venal motive. And that also led to his very judicious approval of the application of violence in certain circumstances, where it was a kind of just war, a way of thinking about strategic uses of violence, as swift as a surgical knife, as he put it, in order to stop an act of violence in its progress. Curiously, not that different from Gandhi's point of view, who was another great hero of mine and whom I studied in India after I left Niebuhr. I had never met Gandhi, of course. He was gone long before I appeared on the scene, but I lived and worked with Gandhians in India. And so much of my career actually began in thinking about issues of religion and violence in the context of India. I lived and worked for a number of years. And that's also what brought me to the issue of religious violence, because I lived in the part of India, the Punjab, where the young Sikhs got involved in a terrible kind of spiral of violence in the 1980s that led to the assassination of Indira Gandhi and thousands of Sikhs killed. But during the worst moments of that conflict, there were hijackings and terrorist attacks, and busloads of Hindus were caught and turned out and taken out and killed alive. It was just a horrible situation. So to try to understand that, which is why I got involved in the study of religion and violence that you're talking about, that's propelled me now for the last 30 years.
And do you, at some level, see what's going on now in a different religious context? I mean, the context of Islam largely is what we're talking about today. Do you see that as, at some level, fundamentally kind of the same thing that was going on with the Sikhs? Or another way of asking the question is just, what principles are general enough to inform your view of that conflict and of what's going on now?
So now you're asking me what I concluded after 30 years of looking at these cases.
Yeah, I figured I'd cut to the chase.
Yeah, and that's a fair question. But first of all, I'll just explain what I did. Because I just applied the oldest kind of sociological method in the world. If you want to know why people are doing the things you're doing, you go and talk to them. So my approach was to try to get inside the mind of people, activists, who were either directly involved in instances that we think of as terrorism related to religion, or who were very close supporters. And so that's what I've done all over the world, from the Hamas movement in Palestine to the people who are directly involved in the first World Trade Center attack, to Christian abortion clinic activists, recently a Buddhist monk in Myanmar who's advocating violence against the Muslims. I went there to talk with him. Next week I'll be back in India looking at what happened to the Sikh movement, and apparently an attempt to try to revive the Khalistan movement in Punjab. So I want to try to get inside the mind of people who see the world in a particular skewed kind of way. The way they see the world almost uniformly in all of these cases is a world at war. A great image of cosmic war, a great notion of conflict between good and bad, and right and wrong, and religion and irreligion. And so religious images are at the heart of this. It's not that religion causes this violence, and I don't want to be misunderstood. I'm sometimes accused of saying, oh, well, you're talking about religious violence, religion. No, I don't mean that. I mean that images and legendary figures, and sometimes the ethical justifications, as in just war, are applied to real-world situations which are thought to be a situation of war. And they then magnify that conflict in an extraordinary kind of way. So my simple takeaway is that these instances of what we see as terrorism are acts of performance to try to bring us who witness it into the worldview of those people who are perpetrating it. And their worldview is one of a world at war. They want us to engage with this kind of confrontation, to play the role of evil enemy in some cases, to play the role of great supporters if they think that they're reaching out to the witnesses of these attacks who might be sympathetic. But these are kind of, again, that's a religious issue, a kind of ritual, a public ritual that's performed that everybody can get involved in. And we do through the media, through internet, through television. We are engaged almost immediately when a terrorist act appears anywhere in the world, whether it was Jerusalem recently or Berlin or Istanbul. We're Paris. We're brought in immediately into that sense of confrontation.
Okay, so on this question of your wanting not to be misunderstood, I mean, the phrase religious violence is in the subtitle of your book, Terror in the Mind of God, and I'm sure some people would say, wait a second, stop right there. The violence isn't religious in its ultimate motivation, and so maybe we can try to zero in on where you do and don't think religion is most important. Now, I've heard you talk a little about the Sunni-Shia tensions, and sometimes those are presented as religious in origin. I mean, I remember, when at some point in the last few years, there was some big upsurge in the prominence of the Sunni-Shia tensions, and the New York Times ran like a little explainer thing on the front page, and it was like for people who are wondering why are Sunni fighting Shia, and I remember it started out like, well, it all goes back to the question of succession over 1,000 years ago, whether it would be, Ali or whoever would succeed in the leadership of Islam. And I thought, I'm not really sure that that's the source of the trouble. So
it's like trying to explain the Catholic-Protestant confrontation in Northern Ireland by going back to the history of the Reformation.
Right. Are they fighting over whether you get saved by faith or by works?
It's kind of interesting, but is it really relevant?
Right. So, and yet you are saying religion is important. So I think maybe we can distinguish between, you're definitely saying that how they conceive of the conflict is religious in nature, and it matters because it helps explain their behavior. But I think you're not saying that how they came to feel that they are in a conflict in the first place, how they came to see a given group as the enemy. I think you're not saying that is fundamentally religious in its origin. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. Let's take some cases. Let's talk not in the abstract, but about real stuff. So let's take something that are more close at hand. Let's say Timothy McVeigh and the attack on the Oklahoma City Federal Building. I didn't interview Timothy McVeigh. In some ways, I didn't need to because we have access to the things that he read and the things that he valued, including most of all a book called The Turner Diaries, which is a novel, kind of fictitious novel about how this group, the Order, a kind of semi-religious group, but Christian, was sort of macho, male, but non-clerical, non-church. They thought that the ordinary churches has sold out to liberalism and multiculturalism. And,
was McVeigh himself a believing Christian? I've forgotten.
Let us define believing Christian.
I'll let you do that.
It was not, to my knowledge, a church-going type, but he bought into this whole picture, which is called cosmotheism, which is a view of the world of Christendom as a kind of mindset, a worldview, a social structure that was under peril. For dominated by white male Christian Protestant heterosexual people, and that they saw all of the characteristics of a multicultural, changing liberal society as extraordinarily threatening to this Christendom. The same thing that Anders Breivik saw in northern Norway. Now
he's the guy who killed all those kids on the island.
Yeah, right. Moved in the island, and the reason why he killed all those kids on the island is that this was a summer camp from a political party that was dedicated to a multicultural vision of a new Norway. And Breivik, I was brought into that by the producers at Norwegian television, trying to figure out what was going on by looking at his manifesto. And his whole manifesto was around the defense of Vienna in 1683, where it was about to be taken over by Ottoman hordes. And in his mind, he was keeping Europe free from being once again conquered by Muslims. Mm-hmm. That's what he thought, was happening. Now, is this? Yeah, it's about religion. It's a defense of Christendom. It's a fear of Muslims. It's a fear of outsiders. But it's not about theology. It's not about, it's not a religious attack. And yet religion is part of the equation, provides a lot of the imagery for people who feel, for whatever socio-personal reasons, marginalized, threatened. Their way of life is under siege in some way. You can see this
like McVeigh,
the rise of the Christian right. We don't have to go to Islam to look at this. We can look at it right in our own backyards.
So McVeigh had personal setbacks, right? He had not. I think in the army he had wanted to. In the military he had wanted to be in the special forces. I think he'd felt rejected by the military, and so things were not going well. This is often true of the people, the young males who are the kind of recruiting fodder for these groups, for starters.
Yeah, sometimes, yeah, and sometimes not. Is the case of the hijackers in 9/11, for example. They seem to be fairly well-established family people. A lot of the young men who are selected for the martyrdom acts, the suicide bombings of Hamas, are just nice kids who are sort of plucked out and brought into what is in their minds a kind of a role to be a soldier in a great war, in a great battle, in a great struggle. So that's what I'm saying. In all these cases, there's this image of a war, a great battle, a great struggle, where young men, and they are almost invariably men, who are kind of called on for part reasons of machismo, to come out and defend their society, defend their people. And there's a religious element to it in that they feel that the threat is from people who are not us, who are, of a different religion, a different identity, but not in a narrow sense religious. This is why I come back to Northern Ireland, Catholic and Protestants. Right. Is it about religion? Nah, well, they're Catholics and they're Protestants.
And there, don't you have to distinguish between religions as belief systems and religions as kind of ethnic groups, ethnic markers? So, for example, when the Sunni, in the wake of our invasion of Iraq, the Sunni came to feel very politically threatened by the Shia, but they didn't feel threatened by their theology in the first instance, right? They felt that they were going to be left out of power and were going to be marginalized, and they had been accustomed to being in power. I mean, that's when I said, can we distinguish between?
It's like Northern Ireland, yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Ethnic groups, one who feels that they're being marginalized, and the Sunnis were being marginalized in the new Iraq. They were only 20% of the population. Shia are 60% of the population. So if George W. Bush is for democracy, which sounds great, to the Sunnis with whom I talked in Iraq, and by the way, I was just in Iraq a few months ago talking with people, primarily refugees from ISIS, to try to get a fix on ISIS, to try to understand what ISIS is. And I think I have some clarity about that. It's several different things. We can talk about that if you want to.
Yeah, we should.
Yeah, but the point is that the Sunni Arabs of Western Al-Anbar region of Iraq felt threatened. They felt marginalized. They felt like they were being kind of alienated from their own country, and they were. The same way that Sunnis in eastern Syria feel alienated from Bashar al-Assad's Syria, is ruled by a kind of a clique of Shia-related Alawites who are excluding Sunnis from power also. So it's ripe for some kind of magical, shining knight to come in on a horse, that's al-Baghdadi, and say, okay, I'm going to create an Islamic State for Sunni Arabs. We're going to have our own country, and we're going to make Sunni Arabs great again. That's the image.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a kind of.
You can make the connection to American politics at the same time, but I mean, that is a global force. It's happening everywhere. It is part of American politics today, as well as all of these things that we're talking about in different parts of the world.
Okay, so we are now talking about ISIS, and even here, some of the origins of the group you can find in what are ultimately kind of social and political conflicts between groups, and in the sense of ethnic identity of the group. We are Sunnis. Our interests on the ground are being threatened, and that is a large part of the origin of the conflict. But then once you got a conflict, it is justified in religious terms, and religious sentiments are mobilized to sustain support for it.
Yes, that's absolutely right, and that's where religion does come into the picture, which is why I've often said that religion is not the problem, but it becomes problematic because it then complicates an already complex kind of situation. In the case of ISIS, there are really three different movements that are kind of coming together, and when we look at the trajectory of what's going to happen after ISIS ends, each of these movements, I think, will have a different trajectory. One is the one we've already talked about, the disaffected Sunni Arabs from the western part of Al-Anbar. They're not religious. They just want a piece of the cake. They just want some power. They are thrilled to be back in control in Mosul because these are former administrators, not allowed to be administrators under the post-Saddam.
I'm not sure how thrilled they are to be in Mosul at the moment, but anyway.
Yeah.
Things are bad in Mosul now. But anyway, sorry, go ahead.
That's right. When they were in charge, it was great. Then there's this inner core, which really are religious in a weird kind of way. This apocalyptic cult, and it's a kind of a marginal cult that's at the margins of Wahhabi Islam, which is also already marginal to Sunni Islam. But they're this kind of weird, kooky little cult that thinks the end of the world is coming right away. I mean, like Tuesday, and they've got to establish the Islamic State and they get ready for the coming of the Mahdi, and everything's going to change. So you've got this inner cult, which is al-Baghdadi is part of, and that group would probably survive even without territory because it's just a wacky visionary cult. I mean, there are tons of wacky visionary cults around the world. They usually don't rule large chunks of territory. And then the third are all this kind of global internet community, which I've been following, or rather my graduate assistants have been following, who can speak Arabic and can get online and can communicate with these people. They've been interacting with young people all over the world who are part of this network of young jihadis who've been attracted by the image of global war. This fantastic thing is, man, this is like computer games on steroids. We're actually going at this red, man. They're chopping off heads. Things are really coming down. Come and join, And often they're, part from marginal communities, immigrant communities, where they feel kind of disconnected anyway. One kid was like 17 years old and says, my mother's trying to take away my computer and doesn't want me talking to all these people. He talks about this larger family of ISIS. He says, but man, it's not going to work. I can get around that. He says, because without them, I'm nothing. So I don't have a life. I don't have friends. This is the only community I have. I mean, this is tragic. This is poignant. If it weren't so lethal, because these are the kids then who are being recruited in droves as cannon fodder. I mean, they're literally being brought in to have suicide belts strapped around their belly and sent out in the front lines. Baghdadi needs them like anything. And they are brought in this romantic image of cosmic war. It's a very tragic situation, but that has its own life. It has its own kind of continuation. These are people who are conducting, driving trucks into Berlin Christmas malls and into the...
Yeah, I think from an American point of view, this is the most alarming thing about it. I mean, they're not gonna sail ships over and attack New York. I mean, the alarming thing is that...
Are they religious?
What's that?
Are they religious?
By they, you mean who?
No, this network, the people who are driving trucks into the Berlin Mall.
I assume they are, right? I assume. I assume that the people who are willing to die in the process of an attack believe that there is an afterlife, right?
I don't know. I mean, you have young people who volunteer for the military all the time who know they're going to be in a situation of peril. Possibly their lives are in danger.
But they most of them go over thinking there's a really good chance they're going to come back alive. I mean, whereas if you drive a truck, although the guy in Istanbul got away, but generally speaking, I mean, people who commit true suicide missions. I mean, generally speaking, I tend to minimize. Well, I think the role of religion in this is in some sense overrated, as I think you do, but I always grant people, look, if you didn't believe in an afterlife, you'd be less inclined to do a suicide mission. If you didn't believe you were going to be,
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that's part of the equation. but I don't think it's all of the equation.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you're right in saying, yeah, religion is a factor, but it's a complicated factor.
Mm-hmm.
Because once you're swept up into the kind of a war situation, I've talked with a lot of people who've been, including in the American military in Afghanistan, but also people who have been swept up and been former jihadis. And it is it's exhilarating. I mean, is there something,
Sure.
there's a rush. There's a rush to being in this kind of we-they situation. It's the same kind of thrill that gets junior high school boys on the computer doing computer games, and they're all war games, by the way. You know, the World of Warcraft 3 or whatever it is, they're in imaginary wars. But how much even more thrilling to be in a real war.
You know, even on a smaller scale, just athletic events. I mean, you know, it's like, you know, being in sports, it's combat, and it's a sense that you're part of something larger. And those are fundamentally the things that I think are in play here.
And the event takes over. It just kind of takes, once you're in it, the event takes. So you may not go in there to die.
Right.
But you go in there because you know it's a potentially lethal situation. That's part of the rush. That's part of the thrill of it. And then once you're in the situation, buttressed by the notions of afterlife or certainly glory, you know, I listened to a lot of the last tapes of young Hamas suicide bombers, right? As they were, you know, the night before they are out to take their mission, they do this like kind of videotape will and testimony, which is then used as a recruiting device to other young people throughout Hamas. They're very interesting. So here are these young guys with a gun. Of course, they're not using it. The gun is prop because they're going to be in with a, you know, explosive belt around them. But they're kind of telling why they're doing, and it's all none of it is about the virgins, you know, and the afterlife. It's all about the glory and about the community and what they're doing for their family, what they're doing for the Palestinian society. And they've been totally in this sense that they are, man, they were nobodies in a road to nowhere. And suddenly, whoa, we are at the center of the world. And the world's going to notice what we've done, what we're going to do. We're going to just blast our ways into eternity in a kind of performance sense as well as a spiritual sense. And I don't know which is more important to them, that sense that of this extraordinary moment, this great event that they are going to be able to pull off, just the thinking about that, or thinking about what's going to happen after, and hoping, of course, they're going to have a life after life of some sort in heaven with all those virgins and all the other comforts of heavenly afterlife. I don't know.
Okay, so
but what they talk about is the glory, not the afterlife.
Okay, so you've used the phrase cosmic war, and in fact, one of your former students, Reza Aslan, wrote a very well-known book that I think was informed by your work.
I hope so. I was his thesis advisor.
There you go. I probably didn't mean you got any of the royalties, but that's the life of an academic.
No, the concept of cosmic war that Reza uses, of course, is the one that I developed in my book, and he gives me credit for it, which is fine. And then he goes off thinking about what are the appropriate ways to respond, and we share that point of view. That one of the ways not to respond is with gangbusters. I mean, if you try to fight cosmic war militarily with another war, you're just feeding into the image that propelled the acts in the first place. I mean, if the whole point of these acts is to kind of bring us into a view of the world at war, isn't it kind of stupid to play into their role? I mean, act like the evil enemy that they say we are. I mean, that's kind of the most kind of the worst kind of response that you would want to make, and yet it's the most typical. And the one in which, unfortunately, the U.S. has been seduced into responding to, and some other countries as well. It was very interesting, though, after the Paris attacks, Hollande initially said this is war, but then he stopped short of actually sending troops on the ground into Iraq, and that's of course what ISIS wanted, because that's a war they could win. They can't win against missiles falling from the sky and local Iraqi troops attacking them. What they wanted was American, European troops that they could really live out the apocalyptic vision of this great confrontation at the end of the days, when the people from the West, the people from Rome in the West, according to this apocalyptic vision, would come, and then there'd be a final confrontation in the fields of Dabiq, this little village in northern Syria, which is the name of their magazine, which, by the way, has now been retaken. And is
yeah,
now
the town
back.
itself has been retaken. It lives on as the name of their magazine, and
They've changed the name of the magazine.
Oh, have they?
It's no longer Dabiq. It's now
that's
Rumia.
That's kind of embarrassing.
Yeah. It's now Rumia, which is the name for Rome, which is, the Westerners from Rome are the ones that are going to be in confrontation. So,
wow.
Yeah, that's how important it was.
That is important. So I take it you think that the last couple of administrations have, to some extent, misplayed this, George Bush and Barack Obama. But maybe
George W. Bush especially, and not just misplayed it, made it worse.
Yeah,
because I'm sure that the violence, in fact, was magnified because the whole message was then advertised. He raised it into this message of cosmic war into a kind of global significance and a global trademark. And then by invading to Muslim countries, he just fulfilled all of the worst aspects of the Al-Qaeda prophecy.
I mean, rhetorically, he tried to be a little careful by saying we are not at war with Islam. And, at the time, that seemed to me like, just common sense. Who would have expected less of a president? But now it looks like we're going to have a president who may not even be able to rise to that level of wisdom. But I will give Bush credit for that.
Commentary for time, yeah.
I will give Bush credit for that, but you're right. The invasions, Afghanistan and then Iraq, who knows where we would be without those. ISIS would presumably not exist if you actually trace its.
And to Obama's credit, and then Hillary Clinton was the Secretary of State when he initially made this decision. Almost immediately when he took office and when she took over, they dropped this war on terror kind of logo, and proclaimed that this is, war on terror is not anything. Terror is a device. You can have a war on terror. And then planned a much more targeted strategy of dealing with Islamic extremism, which led, of course, to the whole drone strategy, which has problems of its own. But at least it wasn't big ground wars invading other countries, and he was determined to try to get out of both Iraq and Afghanistan. With, of course, we've seen the problems that he had in doing so, and he hasn't really been successful either one.
Can you be more specific about what you think he did right or wrong? When you think about these things, do you say, well, some of and it gets, in a way, it gets back to Reinhold Niebuhr, who said that some surgical violence was okay. Do you look at this and go, well, some of these drone strikes make sense, others don't, or look at the current engagement, against ISIS, where we're providing, significant air support?
Obama's most thoughtful statement on this, and maybe one of his most polished pieces, was his acceptance speech of the Nobel Prize for Peace. This happened, as you remember, early on in his administration, and he was given this award largely for not being George W. Bush. Right. And like a lot of the other peace prizes the Nobel Committee gives, it's given out to encourage a peace process, not for something that's already accomplished. People often criticize the Nobel Committee, why did you give it to him so quickly? But if you look at the way they've used the peace award, it's often for situations in process to kind of encourage a more peaceful solution. But at that event, Obama took the opportunity to give a really kind of Niebuhrian speech. And he did credit Niebuhr in that speech for the necessity for the just use of force in order to achieve peace. This is one of the ironies of history, that peace, to be enduring and to be significant, sometimes involves moments of violence. And it was a very thoughtful statement. I'm probably more of I'm somewhere between Gandhi and Niebuhr in my pacifism, and yet I understand the argument. And so in Obama's mind, he was trying to do the best he could. I'll certainly give him the benefit of that. I don't think he or his advisors were quite as aware as they might be of the impact that all those drone strikes had. I read the Karachi Dawn, the newspaper out of Pakistan, and these strikes they're on the front page of the newspaper. They're on like page 15 of the New York Times. We're scarcely aware when they're happening, but I can tell you, it's been really poisoned the kind of view of America in Pakistan. Well, can we put up with that for the sake of trying to deal with a threatening enemy, or can you make the same argument I made about George W. Bush, that this kind of attack in fact makes things worse rather than better? It just increases the kind of solidarity behind the Taliban, which is now, there's no question about it, the Taliban is poised to take over Afghanistan. It has an enormous kind of support within the villages, in part because of the anti-Americanism that has been produced by America's military presence in Afghanistan and from the drone strikes along the border. So it's a complicated picture.
Well, there's also the question of the efficacy, even the kind of direct efficacy of the drone strikes. I mean, the premise of them a lot of times is that kind of if you take out key players, the movement will be greatly impaired. And I think the social science on that is the social science research on that is a little unclear. I think it's far from clear, at least, that so-called decapitation, killing the heads of terrorist movements, has any kind of massively debilitating effect on them. I don't know if you've gotten into that yourself, but.
Oh, sure. Al-Baghdadi and ISIS is a case in point. The original leader of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which is where all of this began, was a guy by the name of Zakari, whom eventually the Americans hunted down and killed. It was a glorious moment. And the U.S. thought it now had controlled Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Now, Al-Qaeda in Iraq was defeated, but not because of that. In fact, it continued even more strongly after Zakari's death for a few months. What really defeated it was the strategy of David Petraeus to withdraw American troops from Al-Anbar province, to then mobilize the local Sunni militia against Al-Qaeda in Iraq. So it was Sunnis, local Sunni Arabs fighting against the Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and they were able to defeat them. Now that's a totally different strategy, and that's the one that actually worked. So al-Baghdadi, who not immediately, but like a third successor, because then his Zakari's successor was also killed, then eventually became the leader. And you can see, you can say that in some ways this decapitation process led to ISIS, which is like the worst threat that you could possibly imagine.
And then there's the
situation with Hamas. The leader of Hamas was Sheikh Yassin, whom I had interviewed many years ago. He was killed by Israeli missile strikes, and his number two man, whom I had also interviewed, Dr. Rantisi, was soon killed, and they thought, that will take care of Hamas. Well, a year later, Hamas roared through the elections in the Palestinian areas of the West Bank and Gaza, and Hamas became victorious, and it's still now in Gaza for that reason. Mm-hmm. And you can trace that back to the Israelis trying to decapitate the movement by killing Sheikh Yassin.
Uh-huh. And speaking...
So not only does it not work, it often makes things worse.
Yeah, and of course this famous American propagandist al-Awlaki, who was killed by drone strike after he left America and went over there. I mean, it turns out that his many YouTube videos or wherever they are seen are. I mean, he almost literally lives on after life, inspiring people.
Oh, yes.
I mean, and if anything, the videos have more power by virtue of the fact that he's martyred.
Yeah.
And so now you just brought up Hamas, and I've been thinking about the Palestinian situation because, it has managed. I mean, if I were a Palestinian and were leading a resistance or whatever, whether in the West Bank or Hamas, and not even necessarily in a militant way. I mean, if I were a Gandhi-esque Palestinian figure in the West Bank, what would most worry me is the conflation in the public mind between what Palestinians are doing and what ISIS is doing, right? And you know that, of course, Bibi Netanyahu would like to make that identification. He would like to make it seem
Well,
like
he did in this recent attack on when the
exactly.
bus recently said, this is an ISIS attack.
Exactly. And, it kind of looked like one because it was somebody driving a truck into a crowd. And I thought, from a Palestinian point of view, the optics of this are very bad. And I'm just wondering if you think, I've almost been surprised by how long this conflation hasn't really happened, except maybe in the eyes of extremely kind of not very observant people who aren't paying much attention. But there hasn't been much identification of the Palestinian situation with the larger jihadist movement, even though, again, I think, Netanyahu would like to make the identification. Are you, when I saw this truck attack, I just thought, well, maybe their luck has run out. It may be that you're going to start, especially with Trump coming into office, who will happily embrace identifying the Palestinian cause with ISIS. Even though, to my knowledge, I don't know what the deal is on this truck driver, but to my knowledge, basically no Palestinians have said, yeah, we like ISIS, so far as I know. Is your sense that you are going to start seeing this kind of conflation, or?
Well, it doesn't take a lot of, you can have like 5 or 6 people. Right. And in a large community of Palestinians, I'm sure there are at least 5 or 6 who are. Right. Who are sympathetic with the ISIS cause, and probably more than that.
Probably at some level, true. Yeah.
Yeah, Hamas, the Hamas leadership doesn't like ISIS, and ISIS, for one thing, ISIS puts down Hamas. If you read Dabiq, it regards the whole Palestinian movement, including Hamas, just to be superficial and weak and ineffectual. And one of the first things it's going to do when it takes over Israel, and that's part of ISIS' desire, of course, to take over the whole of what used to be called the Levant, the whole area of wider Syria, and that includes Israel. It'll get rid of Hamas because it sees it as useless and stupid and and not really, almost any Muslim movement is not good enough from an ISIS point of view, including Hamas. So there's no love lost between Hamas as a movement and ISIS as an organization. But having said that, yeah, I have no doubt that there are a bunch of young people, Palestinians, who are very frustrated with the situation, frustrated with Hamas. They don't see its kind of leadership having done anything or moving them any closer to some kind of dramatic change within the region. Seeing the rise of Netanyahu and Trump, I can easily imagine that there will be this kind of internet connection, because that's now, we live in an era where mobilization takes place even for elections, online, through Twitter, through Facebook. And I've been monitoring these Twitter channels, these Twitter networks, which are really lively. They're really incredibly active, and in some ways very sophisticated graphics, very sophisticated videos. Very sophisticated ways of contacting people, levels of interaction. And my students have been at a point where, they're being tested out by some of these people who are trying to recruit them, because they just assume that, at least half the people online are people like my students. They're not real, susceptible to the cause. They're either agents, FBI agents, or they're some professors, graduate students, or whatever. So they have very careful ways of kind of culling through and going through levels of recruitment. It's a very interesting and sophisticated process.
Huh. Right after 9/11, Brzezinski wrote what I thought was a pretty prescient piece, where he said, "Mark my word, leaders all around the world who face insurgent movements that involve Muslims, whether or not the movements are fundamentally religious in character, nationalistic in character, they will be trying to convince us that this is the same enemy we face." Now, I forget who exactly he mentioned. He may have mentioned Russia and Chechnya. He may have mentioned China and the Uyghurs. He may have mentioned Israel and the Palestinians. But It seems to me that is getting closer and closer to happening. And now we finally have an American president who will embrace it. Whereas I think Obama would have resisted the facile identification of indigenous, somewhat almost ethnic or nationalistic as much as religious, indigenous insurrections. He would have resisted the identification of that with a larger jihadist movement.
Sure. But look at Egypt. Al-Sisi regards the Muslim Brotherhood or terrorists, and so have to be eradicated by the cruelest means possible. And once you've identified the enemy as kind of the evil, shadowy, dark, terrorist other, then you can do almost anything to get rid of them. In the case of Turkey, you have Erdogan claiming a mild-mannered cleric who lives in Pennsylvania and his following to be, who used to be his collaborators, used to be his political supporters, but now they've challenged him on his corruption scandals, and now suddenly they are terrorists. They're part of the evil.
And Obama resisted both of those identifications in Egypt and in Turkey, and Trump will embrace them.
That's the problem. That's the problem. And the consequences are not going to be trivial, because then we will become embroiled in other people's civil wars, other people's, other countries' interactions, and that becomes a very problematic situation indeed. It's not a one-off. It's not something you do casually.
And it helps jihadists trying to recruit Americans to commit homegrown terrorism, right? Because more and more, I mean, the clash of civilizations, it's been becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy for some time, I think, but now with Trump, it's official. He is the first president to officially embrace the clash of civilizations as the paradigm.
Which means that the possibility of terrorism on American soil under the Trump administration is going to be extremely high. It's going to be much, much more likely, unfortunately, because it presents himself as such a compelling case. He's almost a archetypal evil capitalist Western enemy. And he's playing the role.
And then that can then feed on itself. I mean, if the homegrown terrorism leads him to draconian domestic measures, surveillance of mosques and so on, that feeds into the narrative, the jihadist narrative, and so on. And there we go.
And what does religion have to do with all of this?
Oh, yeah. I forgot. Why don't you remind us?
Yes, but I mean, this is, a good point in the conversation. I come back to that because it's clear that, it's an element, but it's a very complicated story, and it has to do with clashes of power and marginalized people who are socially, economically alienated, and they get into a situation of conflict, and sometimes dramatic conflict, and it becomes elevated into this kind of high proscenium of religious drama. And when that happens, it becomes, then we say, here we have an example of religious violence. What we have an example of is religionized violence. And if I thought that people could understand what that meant, I would call it that, religionized violence rather than religious violence in my books and my articles. Instead, I use the term religious violence, but then I try to explain what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about violence caused by religion, but violence in which religion becomes a part of the picture in complicated and interesting ways.
Okay. Well, we're almost out of time, but I would like to return a little to the subject of Reinhold Niebuhr. I mean, have you asked yourself what he would think of the world, of the challenge we face and that you and I have just been describing? Do you think he would more or less agree with you on these policy issues?
Yeah, I sure hope so. We talked a lot about the kind of limits of violence and the role of violence in a peaceful world. And it's not as if Niebuhr lived through quiet times. There are, World War II and the struggles and the domestic struggles in the United States were all part of his awareness. The rise of civil rights. Back in the 1930s, he was advocating that the black people in the United States take on protest movements as a leverage of power. So he understood the consequences of confrontation, and also I think understood that violence can fuel violence. And so he's very judicious in the way, this wonderful essay on why the Christian church is not pacifist, where Niebuhr talks about not just the just application of violence, but the limits of it, the limits of force, and the danger of not thinking about the use of violence within a pacifist context. Mm-hmm. And for him, it's enormously different whether you think about violence in a violent context, or whether you think about the use of violence in a pacifist context. Mm-hmm. In other words, if your aim is to shift the whole character of a conflict from one of violent confrontation to civil discourse and civil engagement, then the way you use violence has to be extremely strategic and has to be very careful and not exacerbate the situation, make it worse. So I think he would be sympathetic with the dilemma of Obama, maybe not approve of everything that he's done, but certainly understand this to try to bring a situation back to a level of civil discourse. That may not, unfortunately, be what the outcome, but that certainly is the intention. He would understand that, as opposed to the kind of George W. Bush cowboy, we, they, seeing the world in Manichaean terms of black and white, you're either with us or against us, and invading whole countries. That he certainly would not approve of. I was.
You feel sure he would not have approved of the invasion of Iraq, Niebuhr?
Oh, absolutely. When I knew him, he was very critical of Richard Nixon and the war in Vietnam, and what he regarded as, at that time, as an imperial presidency. And he wrote about it at the time that this kind of notion that the United States could, in an imperial kind of way, bring a Pax Americana to the rest of the world, and do so through military actions like Vietnam, just fundamentally rubbed him the wrong way. And so he did not see this as a just use of violence at all. Just the opposite. He was very much opposed to the war in Vietnam.
He was.
And so he would certainly feel the same way about Iraq, and I think also about Afghanistan. I mean, that's supposedly the good war, but that was flawed from almost the beginning, because the attention was turned to the Taliban rather than on Al Qaeda and capturing those guys and bringing them to justice, which should have been the point. That was, after all, the whole reason. Right?
Yeah, we outsourced that, which was a mistake in retrospect. Yeah. Do you think Niebuhr's views were to some extent misappropriated on behalf of the Cold War? I mean, he was at some level a Cold Warrior. He considered it a good struggle, but if he was against the Vietnam War, then he wasn't one of the more ardent Cold Warriors. And of course, look, if he was on the cover of Time magazine a couple of times, it means he met with the approval of Henry Luce, who was a co-founder of Time magazine, who was quite the Cold Warrior himself. Do you think that Niebuhr's views were implicitly or explicitly at all distorted in the course of his becoming such an icon?
Oh, absolutely. And of course, that's the danger when you talk about the just use of force. I mean, even an abortion clinic bomber with whom I talked outside of Washington, D.C., convicted for bombing abortion clinics. It was a Lutheran pastor, loved Niebuhr and Bonhoeffer. And they thought that gave him the ethical justification for bombing abortion clinics.
Yeah, we should say that Bonhoeffer is another person who was at Union Theological Seminary a while. He was German, and he went back to Germany during World War II and was ultimately executed for conspiring to assassinate Hitler. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, and he left actually, I think I stayed in the room in Hastings Hall at Union where Bonhoeffer had.
Do you know what room it was? I have a room in Hastings. Maybe it's mine.
On the third floor.
No,
I
I'm on
want
the second.
313, 315, something like that.
Okay.
But anyway, this certainly would not be approved by either Niebuhr or Bonhoeffer, this kind of justification for a holy war. That was not the point at all. But they can easily be misappropriated in such a way. And the whole idea of realism, of not wanting to force one's morality on everybody else, that is, can be taken as a way of disengagement, of not being concerned about injustice in other parts of the world. Jean Kirkpatrick, for example, quoted Niebuhr on many occasions when she was the foreign policy advisor under Reagan.
She was the ambassador to the UN for a while too. Yeah.
Ambassador to the UN, yeah, for right-wing causes. So it's
specifically neoconservative, I would say in her case. And if Niebuhr in fact stood against the imposition of your values on other countries, then he really should not, in that regard at least, be cited by neoconservatives. Right,
exactly. So he can be easily misconstrued, and the idea that somehow he would embrace, the kind of capitalist agenda of the Bush administration is ludicrous. I mean, he still remained a socialist to the end of his life. He was, even though he was not the Marxist that he was in his youth, he was still saw this as the most honorable form of social and economic organization.
So he's associated with the phrase Christian realism, which at one level I gather means let's face it, we are highly imperfect beings, and so there is some limit to our realistic aspirations, the extent to which we can perfect society. But realism is also a term in foreign policy, and I gather his version of realism applies there. I mean, in foreign policy, realism does include the idea that you can't always impose your values on a society. You should be careful in doing so. You should, you will sometimes have to accept the continued rule of bad people because the alternative of invading their country would be worse, would be more destabilizing, more people would die, and so on. I mean, that's all. So was Niebuhr's use of the term realism, did he make an explicit connection with its use in that foreign policy sense of the term realism?
Yes, and he was in fact conversant with Morgenthau and other people in the foreign policy arena when he was a theologian. But realism was on both a personal and a collective level, in that the original sin, in biblical terms from Niebuhr's point of view, and he was kind of a Barthian on this, was pride, thinking that one could be like God. And that translates into this extraordinary drive for self-interest. And he saw collectivities of any form, unless they were communities, unless they were like a church or a family. But a collectivity like a company or a political organization was simply the extensions of individual self-interest and not an extension of their agape, their forgiving love. That banks can never cry and say, I'm sorry, for example. They will not forgive your loan. They can't, for fiduciary reasons. They are extension of the self-interest of those stockholders that created them. Corporations are not people, my friend. The Supreme Court is fundamentally wrong on that for Niebuhrian terms because he saw them as collectivities, expressions of self-interest, and for that reason, they always have to be checked. They will use morality as moralism, as a cloak for self-interest, and this includes nations in an international arena, as well as corporations, business, and other kinds of collectivity. And this is why, from Niebuhr's point of view, you needed countervailing power. Mm-hmm. You needed labor unions to be countervailing power against corporate structures. Now, labor unions are also organizations. They are also extensions of self-interest. That's quite true. But in a situation where you have one form of...
You need balance.
You need a balance. You need to be checked. Or you need structures of justice, which is where the government comes in, where you have an attempt at kind of participatory shared interest that goes throughout the whole of society rather than simply the shared interest of only a small number of people. That's the model of democracy and why Niebuhr would be so concerned about the direction in which contemporary democracy is going, or the kind of plutocracy, the kleptocracy of American politics is very disturbing because it just undermines the whole idea of government as the protector of the structures of justice that give a fair shake for everyone, protects everybody's self-interest, not just the few. But it goes back to the idea of self-interest that is that's the operating force in the public arena, which is why we should always be suspicious of any country's moralism when it engages with another country on an international level.
Okay. Final question. I mean, we've gotten at this from various angles, but I haven't asked you head on, like, what do you think of the coming Trump administration in this context, the context of the so-called war on terror? And I think we can already safely infer that you're not entirely optimistic. But are there specific things that you most worry about, or are there maybe some things you find reassuring about Trump as you envision him?
Well, the only thing I can think of that's reassuring is the thing that also worries me, and that is that he is just so unpredictable. He's not ideological. He's not really a man of principles, which means that he just responds almost viscerally in unpredictable ways, that can change from day to day, that do not have any uniting ideological force, which in some ways is good. I mean, as someone like Cruz or even as Vice President Pence would adopt a more single-mindedly ideological course in their presidency. I don't. For that reason, there may be surprising. There may be moments of surprising kind of liberality in Trump's decisions, but for that reason also there may be moments of just absolutely wacky, irresponsible kinds of reactions that in an international level could be extremely dangerous.
Yeah. There will be surprises. I think we can safely predict that. Well, Mark, thank you so much for taking the time. People should read your books. Terror in the Mind of God, I'm sure, is still relevant.
The 4th edition of Terror in the Mind of God is in the press right now. I just finished it. We'll have a lot of stuff on ISIS. We'll have a lot of stuff on the rise of Buddhist violence in Myanmar, of Christian violence, including Breivik, and the rise of the religious right in Europe and the United States.
When's it coming out?
The whole thing is up to date. In a few months, it should be out, and it's in press right now. I would hope maybe in 4 or 5 months.
Excellent. And your
4th edition, Terror in the Mind of God.
And your very prescient 1993 book, again, was reissued under the name Global Rebellion and is available.
Right.
Anything else that you're working on or that you want to talk about?
Recent book that came out, which is called God in the Tumult of the Global Square, a book that's based on a 5-year Luce Foundation project, interviews around the world to kind of take the temperature of religion, both in a violent sense, but also the possibilities and the promise of global religion, of a religion, a religiosity of the global era. And from that, I was helped with Bob Bellow, as probably one of Bob Bellow's last pieces was the piece that he did for this book, and I use as the basis for one of the chapters in thinking about a global civil society or a global civil religion.
And he had also been at Berkeley, like you, right?
Yeah, we were colleagues together at Berkeley.
Yeah, he was a great scholar of religion. Okay, well, listen, thank you so much. Maybe you can, after we've seen a year or so of this administration, maybe I'll try to get you to check back in with us. And,
I look forward to it.
Okay.
Great talking with you.